Okay, so I just began the recording, by the way, so I'm going to unmute Greg. Greg, why don't you go ahead and tell us what your impression is about what Rabbi Zeff is going to be speaking about today, by way of introduction. Hold on, you're not muted. One second. Your computer is locking you out. See, this is the wonderful thing about Zoom. Okay, you're still locked out. Andy, do you want to help your husband there? Oh, there you go. Go ahead.
There. Okay. I'll let Rabbi Zeff say what Rabbi Zeff is talking about, except to perhaps begin by saying that whatever he's talking about, Rabbi Zeff will say, put on your seatbelts. And that's something that we can always expect from Rabbi Zeff, that it will be an interesting and thought-provoking shiur. Rabbi Zeff was, of course, the rabbi of the Westwood Kehilla for many years until making Aliyah. He and I share 4 grandchildren together, for which I am very grateful. And he is my not only my rabbi, but my very, very good friend, and a fabulous intellectual. And I think you'll all be interested in what he's going to speak on.
Okay, so
by the way, just one more thought. I know there's always a fundraising pitch in all of this. The banquet is coming up. We're honoring Rabbi Stewart and Chandy Stewart. If you haven't made your donations yet, please go to kehilla.org, and there's a place to click on for the banquet, and please feel free to go to that and make a donation in honor of Rabbi Stewart. You can do that either by going to the donation bar up there, or there's a Rabbi. What's the other?
It says Visionary Award, so just click on that.
Go to Visionary Award, and thank everyone for doing that, and I see most of you have already done that, and we're very appreciative.
Okay.
Rabbi,
thank you.
Zeff.
No. It's my turn. You didn't say what I wanted you to say, but I'm going to say it for you. Okay. Rabbi Joel Zeff, Kiela's rabbi for many years before making Aliyah. We'll be exploring one of Rav Kook's most controversial teachings, containing a severe critique of how Jews understood and practiced their Judaism. A teaching that provoked a firestorm of opposition. Okay. Now, it just happens to be that this morning I read the following Pischei Tshuva in Hilchos Nida. I was learning with my brother this morning before today's shiur. He lives in Houston and he's preparing for his smicha bechina, so I was helping him learn Hilchos Nida. So there's a fascinating Pischei Tshuva in discussing a certain chumrah. I'm not going to go into the details, a certain stringency. For those of you that are familiar with the Or Zarua, Chibuk V'Nishuk, I'm not going to go into any details for right now. We'll leave it at that. But it's a chumrah, a stringency. And the Pischei Tshuva writes something amazing from the Radvaz. He writes, pardon me for 1 second. I have a child coming in here. Okay. Pischei Tshuva writes that in quoting the Radvaz, he says, why do you want to bring in more chumras? Can't you just let Jews try to practice Judaism? Their practice is already bad enough. We don't have to add stringencies. It's a pretty amazing sort of language. But with that, especially because my daughter with special needs just walked into the room. Hi, Kehilla. So I'm going to invite Rabbi Zeff to take over the reins. I'll mute myself. And I encourage you all, as the notice said, to keep your seatbelts fastened.
Hi, everybody. And it goes without saying that this is a pleasure to be back again in Westwood, even if it's digitally. And with those lengthy introductions, I actually don't have enough time to cover the topic, but maybe we can reschedule for next week. No, of course, there's plenty of time. Now, the name Rav Kook, Rabbi Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, is familiar to most of you. Anybody who has been learning with me, there's some new faces here that I don't know. But most of you are people that I have known for years and have loved for years. And you hear from me a lot, that name, Rav Kook. And you also may be aware that he was and is controversial. As a matter of fact, there are many yeshivot, institutions of higher Jewish learning, that are associated with certain sectors of the Orthodox world that will not have any of his books in their library. If you were to see a picture of Rabbi Kook, you would wonder why that should be so, because he looks like a Jew from Mea Sharim, from the the most hardcore sectors of ultra orthodoxy. That was the way he lived his life. That was the way he grew up. That was his education. And yet, for some reason, in spite of the fact of the way he dressed and comported himself in terms of piety, in terms of his mastery of traditional Jewish learning, somehow there's something ultra controversial about him that till this very day, there are major sectors of the Orthodox world that will not have his books on their shelf. What I hope to do in the next about 48 minutes is to be able to give you a sense of how radical Rav Kook's thinking was, and that the fact that he was, and to a certain extent today, is banned from certain sectors of orthodoxy is not so much that he was misunderstood by those sectors, but precisely because they did understand how radical his thinking was, at least in terms of sort of traditional Jewish thinking as it existed in the first half of the 20th century. Everybody ready to dive in? Now, what I want to do is just give you a little sense of who Rav Kook was in terms of biographical information. For those of you who studied with me in the past, you've heard most of this before, but I'll try to do it quickly. So Rav Kook was born in 1865 in Latvia. Now, Latvia at that time is really just part of Jewish Lithuania. That makes him a Litvak. Now, I don't know if that term means anything to you, but in traditional Jewish circles, the person who comes from that area of the world where Talmudic scholarship was the supreme value, there is an association of being brilliant, super intellectual, uncompromising, and a misunderstanding, very non-spiritual. It happens to be that's not quite true, but that's sort of the mystique of being a Litvak. Now, you might also be aware that the this ethos of we'll call it spirituality that existed in Lithuania, this emphasis on Talmudic study, on rational thinking, that there was a kind of counter force that had developed in Eastern Europe. That's the Hasidic movement. So whereas in the Lithuanian Jewish circles, the supreme value, the supreme experience of spirituality is the study of Talmud, in Hasidic circles, the supreme spiritual value, I think it's fair to say, was prayer, ecstatic prayer. And as a matter of fact, one of the flashpoints between the Hasidic movement and Lithuanian Orthodoxy was over, this could be a whole separate analysis that maybe we'll do another time. There's a phrase we find in Talmudic literature, there's a mosquito, Torah lishma, to learn Torah for its own sake. What does that mean, to learn Torah for its own sake? In Lithuanian circles, learning Torah for its own sake means you learn Torah in order to understand it. You're learning Torah. Why are we doing this? We want to understand what it says. Whereas in Hasidic circles, this is quite explicit in the sources. When we talk about learning Torah for its own sake, it actually means to learn Torah in order to experience mystical communion with God. And that distinction there of learning Torah in order to understand it versus learning Torah as a means for a higher value, which is this mystical communion with God, sort of give you a sense of these two competing visions of Jewish spirituality. Emphasis on the intellect and the careful study of texts versus a desire to experience mystical communion with God, and Torah and observance being a vehicle for that. Now, these two visions of orthodoxy were very much at loggerheads, and it may seem difficult for you to understand what is so terrible about each of these different views in the eyes of the competing camps. That's a discussion for another time. But suffice it to say that what is unique about Rav Kook is that he's coming out of that world of Lithuanian Orthodoxy. His father was a distinguished Torah scholar who had studied in the Harvard of yeshivot of that time, which was in a town called Volozhin. But what is unique about Rav Kook was that his mother was from a Hasidic family. This is truly a type of intermarriage. So his father is coming from one sense of Jewish spirituality, of the intellectual Talmudic focus, and his mother from a Chabad Hasidic family with the emphasis on joyful worship and communion with God. And I have a theory that this explains a lot about in his genes. Already in his genes is a kind of integration of what could be viewed as opposing worlds. And that an ability to bridge opposing worlds and synthesize them together is something that accompanied him all of his life, particularly in a different context. And that's the next step we're going to talk about. After Rav Kook had studied in the same yeshiva that his father had studied in Volozhin, which was founded, by the way, by the chief disciple of the Vilna Gaon, the greatest Talmudic genius of that era. So after his period in the yeshiva in Volozhin, Rav Kook became the rabbi of two different communities in Lithuania, which is quite an achievement. It's not like being your local Orthodox rabbi. To be the Rav of a community in Lithuania, that was a position that was reserved for truly great Torah scholars. In 1904, Rav Kook, after his period of being rabbi of two different communities, receives an invitation to come to the land of Israel, to move to Palestine at that time. And at this point, it's under Ottoman auspices, the Ottoman Empire. And he's invited by the Jewish community of Yaffo to become the chief rabbi of Yaffo, of the Jewish community in Yaffo. Now, bear in mind, 1904, Yaffo, which today is called Tel Aviv-Yaffo, Yaffo and Tel Aviv are the same municipality. There's no Tel Aviv. There's only Yaffo. Yaffo is the urban center of the pioneers, the Chalutzim, that had come to the land of Israel inspired by Zionism. Now we have to back up a little bit. There were major waves of immigration to the land of Israel at the end of the 18th century and through the 19th century of ultra-Orthodox Jews. Interestingly enough, disciples of these two warring camps from Eastern Europe. Disciples of the Vilna Gaon, the Litvaks, with their mode of Jewish spirituality, and disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. There were significant waves of immigration in these two communities, and they settled in Jerusalem, Sfat, Tiberias, Hebron. They didn't start agricultural colonies. They were not inspired by Karl Marx. Right? They saw coming to the Holy Land as a spiritual experience, a place where the divine presence was greater, and they came for pietistic reasons. But at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we find a very different wave of immigration to the land of Israel. And these are Herzl and his associates. Now, these were a lot of Jews coming from different ideological backgrounds. Some of them were actually traditional Jews in practice, but inspired by the notion of Jews returning to their ancestral homeland, for all kinds of different reasons. But among them were also Jews who had abandoned traditional Jewish observance and thought and attempted to radically remake what it means to be a Jew, which is not defined in religious terms or spiritual terms, but in nationalistic terms. And this involved also ideas about what a Jewish state could look like based upon socialism, sometimes based upon Marxist theory, etc. And these Jews, these pioneers, some of them were members of the bourgeoisie who settled in urban centers, like in Yafo, but many of them were these pioneering Jews who started agricultural settlements to move Jews back to the earth, become farmers. So Rav Kook leaves Eastern Europe, where you have the tension between the Hasidim and the opponents of the Hasidim, called Mitnagdim, the opponents, which means the opponents. It comes to the land of Israel, into the maelstrom of internecine warfare again. This time, not so much between Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, the non-Hasidic opponents of the Hasidic movement, but rather what's called the old Yishuv. Yishuv means settlement, and the new Yishuv, the new settlement. That is, the original immigrants who were very pious followers of the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon, who settled in urban areas, in conflict with the members of the new Zionist ways of immigration, who largely were non-religious or anti-religious. Excuse me. And Rav Kook thinks that he is going to become a bridge personality, that he's going to somehow, because of the unusual mixture of his genes, I don't know if he himself saw it that way, but his unusual internal life, that he can somehow act as a bridge between these two warring factions. I just want you to bear in mind. Imagine looking at, if you were a member of the old Yishuv, you're one of these pious Jews that was coming from the Hasidic tradition or the non-Hasidic Lithuanian tradition. When you look at these Zionist pioneers, what do you see? You see destroyers of Judaism. You see Jews who are trying to remake Jews into some type of barbaric nationalistic image, adopting the ways of nationalism current in Europe in the 19th century, casting off any form of piety and traditional Jewish belief. And imagine if you were a Zionist pioneer looking at the old Yishuv, you would see what you would consider to be relics of the past, parasites, economic parasites who contribute nothing to the economic well-being of the Jewish people. People whose ideas are medieval or worse, steeped in superstition, and who will in fact be cast into the waste bin of history as time goes on. That the future belongs to us, not to them. So you can imagine that this is not going to be a pretty scene when you have these two populations together in the same little slice of land. 1904, Rav Kook comes. He's the rabbi what does that mean to be their rabbi? They're not religious Jews. It means that he tried to encourage them to be able to farm in a way that conformed to Jewish law so they could sell their products to anybody, like by taking tithes from their produce, that things should be kosher, etc. And Rav Kook stays there in Yafo for 10 years, 1904 to 1914. He never plans on leaving the land of Israel. And at this point, he's somewhat controversial but not explosively so. Why? Because he's in Yafo. Yafo is very far from Jerusalem. I mean, in contemporary standards, it's not very far. I believe Svi Smith used to live in Yafo. I haven't seen him for a while. It's not that far from Jerusalem, right? But in those days, it's over there. But then something radical happens. In 1914, Rav Kook attends the International Convention of the only Jewish organization to which he ever belonged, which was Agudat Yisrael, Agudas Yisrael, which is the organization of ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's the only organization he ever belonged to. It's telling. He goes to Europe to attend their convention. Why? He never wanted to leave the land of Israel. It's because he felt a compelling need to wake these rabbis up, 1914, and tell them that the winds have shifted, that there's a historical process of renaissance in the Jewish people going on, and they must encourage their flock to leave Europe and to come to the land of Israel and to be part of this national renaissance of the Jewish people in its ancestral homeland. Well, unfortunately, World War I broke out soon after Rav Kook arrived in Europe, and he was stuck in Europe for 4 years. He spent the first 2 years in Switzerland, where he was a house guest of a wealthy benefactor. He spent all of his time in study, contemplation, and writing. Some of Rav Kook's most important literary works come from this time period. By the way, I'm looking for a similar benefactor. It doesn't have to be in Switzerland. West would be fine. You have a nice house. Put me up there for a couple of years. And so you can contact me offline if you have any suggestions for that. Now, the next 2 years, Rav Kook spends in London, where he's the rabbi of a synagogue in London. Now, this is a very important period. This is the period when World War I results in the destruction of the Ottoman Empire and Britain having a mandate over Palestine. This is the period in which the British government, before the war was over, issued the Balfour Declaration, in which the British government commits itself to the vision of a Jewish state in Palestine. And Rav Kook is in London at this time and is involved in many of these discussions, trying to elicit sympathy among the British government for this Zionist vision. After the war is over, Rav Kook now can return to the land of Israel. But Rav Kook receives an invitation to return not to Yafo, but to Jerusalem, and to become the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. Rav Kook was actually very reluctant to take on this responsibility for many reasons, including the fact that you'll remember Jerusalem is the very epicenter of the old Yishuv. They have their own rabbis. Who is this Rabbi Kook who is being planted in Jerusalem under British auspices, supposedly as their rabbi? They have their own rabbis. And Rav Kook already, even though he was a pious and tremendously learned and dressed like them and spoke like them, but they already sensed that there's something a little bit different about Rabbi Kook. And Rabbi Kook wasn't sure this is where he wanted to be. It would stir up trouble. And Rav Kook, even though he stirred up a tremendous amount of trouble, was a man of peace. But he took the position anyway, out of a feeling of morphed into, within 2 years, in 1921, to become the chief rabbi, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of all Palestine. So Rav Kook is the first holder of the position of chief rabbi of Israel, but under the British mandate before there's a state of Israel. Now I'm going to describe all hell breaking loose. In 1920, which is when he was chief rabbi of Jerusalem, but not quite the chief rabbi of the whole land of Israel, Rav Kook published a small work right here. This is it. It's called Orot, which means lights. This is a collection of writings from his time in Switzerland when he was a house guest in the house of this wealthy benefactor. And this little book, Orot, was so controversial that a counter book was published. I would say a counter pamphlet was published just to condemn Rav Kook's book, Orot, Lights. And this counter pamphlet was called Kol Shofar, the voice of the shofar. Why? As part of the ceremony of excommunication, a shofar is blown. So this pamphlet, which was published attacking Rav Kook and his book Orot, was a kind of symbolic excommunication of the author of the book. Now I'm going to read to you a sentence from that pamphlet, The Voice of the Shofar, Kol Shofar. There was brought before us a recently published booklet by a local rabbi. And I just want you to appreciate local rabbi. Rav Kook is the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. He's world famous. There was brought before us a recently published booklet by a local rabbi. We were astonished to see gross things foreign to the entire Torah of Israel. Deadly poison is in it. Now, with that recommendation, wouldn't you go out and buy this book right after buying John Bolton's book? Come on. With that kind of review, wow. Now, in a few minutes, you're going to see what's so controversial about this book. We're going to take a look at a passage. But I just want to describe a little bit the controversy itself, sort of the politics a little bit more. It happened to be that one of the most prominent rabbis of Eastern Europe was in Israel at the time, Palestine. This was the rabbi who was the head of the largest Hasidic movement of the time, the Ger Rebbe, Rabbi Avraham Mordechai Alter, the Ger Rebbe. He was the rabbi of the largest Hasidic movement from Poland. He came to the land of Israel at the time, checking out the possibility of a mass migration of his followers to the land of Israel. And since he happened to be there at the time, he was asked to arbitrate between Rabbi Kook and those who were attacking him. And he interviews Rabbi Kook. He interviews the opponents of Rabbi Kook. He praises the knowledge and piety of Rabbi Kook, but he also criticizes, and I quote, the strange things in his book. He also criticized the disrespectful attitude of the opponents of Rabbi Kook, and he says that he's brokered an agreement between the parties, where Rabbi Kook would express his regret over passages which may have offended people, and the opponents of Rabbi Kook would cease in their campaign of defamation against Rabbi Kook. Of course, this agreement was as worthless as the paper that it was written on. Nothing ever came of it. And Rav Kook was the object of defamation, vilification until the day he died in 1935, and sometimes violent. So much so, by the way, that even during this early period, after Rav Kook published Orot, several rabbis were put in jail by the British for their violent defamation of Rav Kook, because under British law, you're not allowed to defame a public figure. And he had an official post as the chief rabbi of Jerusalem and then that of Israel. Now, what about this book Orot that so outraged these other pious Jews? So I'd like to focus on one particular passage. I'm going to return to Kol Shofar, that pamphlet that was written to attack the book and was sort of an excommunication of Rav Kook. I want to read one sentence from it. even those young men and women who engage in athletics and frivolity, known to us to be Sabbath desecrators and immoral, he claims to be serving Avodat HaKodesh, holy service. Now I'm going to read to you a passage from the Ger Rebbe's report on his attempt at moderating the conflict. And the Ger Rebbe writes the following: to glorify the athletics of sinners and to flatter them in such a shocking manner, to extend peace to them as if they were ministering angels, malachei sharet in Hebrew. This outrages the pious beyond description. What I'd like to do with the rest of our time is to take a look at this passage, this specific passage, which is sort of emblematic of Rav Kook's radical thinking, that somehow flatters sinners in such a shocking manner, right? Etc. What is he talking about? Now, I hope that you have access to the source sheet here. If you don't, you'll just listen to me reading from it. I could do a screen share, but I'm not going to. Why? Because I like looking at your beautiful faces. And if I do a screen share, then what's on the screen is the text, and your faces get squished to the side and I can't see anybody. I do like to know if people are awake or not and smiling or interested. So that's why I'm not doing the screen share. Someone, Clark, it sounds like you wanted to say something? No? Okay. But so people should, not everybody here is muted. Clark, you're not muted.
Oh.
And it's pretty embarrassing what I just heard in the background, Clark. That's a joke. Okay. Let's read. I think we're just going to, for efficiency's sake, we're just going to read in English. Does that work for people? And Rabbi Stewart, I have the Hebrew text there too. Just, you'll know I'm not making this up.
Thank you very much.
Rav Kook says the following: great is the bodily demand made upon us. We require a healthy body. Now, so far, that is not, I hope that's not controversial, right? There's actually codified in the medieval law codes that there is a religious commandment to take care of your health. Okay, nothing particularly controversial about that. But in the third sentence, things go downhill quick, or uphill. We have dealt much with spirituality. The Jewish people, we're experts in spirituality. But we have forgotten the holiness of the body. We have abandoned health and bodily strength. We have forgotten that we have holy flesh, no less than we have a Holy Spirit. We have left practical life, the clarification of the senses, and the bond with bodily sensory existence. I'll explain all these terms in a minute. Due to a fallen fear, due to a lack of faith in the holiness of the land. Now I'm going to back up and let's talk about what he means here. Rav Kook starts out with a stinging criticism of the contemporary sense of what it means to be a Jew. He says, we're experts in spirituality, but we've forgotten the holiness of the body. Something's wrong with us spiritually, our whole sense of who we are as Jews. We engage in prayer and study, but what about this? Rav Kook suggests that just as a human being has a soul and a body, so too a nation is constructed of those parallel components. A nation has a body. What is the body of a nation? First and foremost, it's land. But all institutions of state and social structures are expressions of the body of the Jewish people. An economic system is an expression of the body of a nation. A judicial system is an expression of the body of a nation. Its army and police, etc., are expressions of the body of the nation. But a nation, just like a person, all has a soul, a sense of a spiritual vision, a sense of a lofty and transcendent sense of what it means that I'm alive, a sense of purpose, which is spiritual. Just like an individual has those two components, so does a nation. In the case of the Jewish nation, our soul is what we would conventionally call Judaism, the Torah, its worldview and its way of life. But what about the body of the nation? Rav Kook says that, unfortunately, because of historical circumstances, that the primal expression of the body of the nation, its land, we've been deprived of that through no fault of our own. We're in exile. We don't have a land. And as a result of that, a distortion set in, where Jews over the centuries, because they did not live in a normal framework of landedness, of bodiless, came to forget that that is half the dimension. I don't know, half is the right word, but that is the complementary aspect of what it means to be whole, body and soul. We became, as a nation, a disembodied soul. But worse than that, we made a virtue out of it. Let me give you an example of a typical type of sermon that you yourselves might have heard, not from Rabbi Stewart, of course, but maybe like a super ultra Orthodox Jew like Greg Smith might say something like this. When Yitzchak is facing his son, who he thinks is Esav, but it's really Yaakov, right? And Yaakov is dressed up with fur on his arms, so he looks like Esav. So Yitzchak, who's blind, makes the comment that, this is very confusing because the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Very confusing. That sentence right there, which of course in context is a description of what Yitzchak is experiencing, that there's this person in front of him who's claiming to be Esau and feels like Esau, the hands are the hands of Esau, but the voice is the voice of Jacob, Kol Yaakov. There are a lot of Sidurim that are called the voice of Jacob, Kol Yaakov. Many, many rabbis have given sermons that say that that verse should also be considered to be emblematic of the difference between what it means to be Jacob, the quintessential Jew, and what it means to be Esau, the rest of humanity, the Western world. Jacob is the realm of the voice. The voice is the voice of Jacob. That's our realm. That's our unique experience. That's our unique contribution. The realm of the voice. What does that mean? With our voice, we study Torah. With our voice, we pray. Hands, that's Esav. That's Rome. Physicality. So there's this sense of we're not physical, and that's the way we're supposed to be. We're spiritual, the voice. And over there, the Gentile world, they inhabit the realm of the body, hands. This attitude, according to Rav Kook, was the unfortunate and perhaps unconscious effect of exile. It's almost like someone who suffers some type of bodily limitation, perhaps someone who's blind, as an example, who might develop extraordinary hearing or extraordinary tactile capability and sensation in order to compensate for the lack of being able to see. Rav Kook suggests that the Jewish people have overcompensated for our lack of a national body, particularly in terms of land, by making a virtue out of being just a spirit, just a soul. That being disembodied is now, according to this distorted understanding that has crept into Jewish self-awareness by the time you get to the 19th century, that becomes the ideal, that we are a nation exclusively of the voice, not of the body. And this expresses itself on a personal level, that Jews don't pay sufficient attention to the material world and physicality, and it expresses itself on the collective sense of how we understand ourselves as a nation. And Rav Kook says, if you go back to the text, just where we left off, he says, we have left practical life, the clarification of the senses, the bond with bodily sensory existence, right? The whole notion of senses. The arts, the artistic endeavor, according to Rav Kook, is part of bodiliness. It's a noble expression of bodiliness, and it's a certain more abstract, perhaps, expression of bodiliness, but bodiliness it is. But until modern times, according to Rav Kook, Jews did not fully embrace the artistic endeavor. Not just for reasons of graven images, etc., but more fundamental, that the notion of embracing physicality and the senses became something foreign to us as a result of assimilating, in an exaggerated sense, the unfortunate effects of exilic existence, a non-bodily existence. And then Rav Kook says, due to a fallen fear. What does he mean by that? Yirat Shamayim, the fear of God. It's an important value. Rav Kook says that we have assimilated a fallen fear, a distorted sense of what fear of God is. Fear of God does not mean withdrawal from engaging the world, from engaging material existence. But Rav Kook suggests that the Jewish people interpreted fear of God as to retreat into the exclusive realm of the voice of prayer, of learning. And by insulating ourselves in this realm, we can preserve our uniqueness. We are people of the voice, right? This is this distorted self-understanding. And we can protect ourselves from sin, which crouches at the door, which is a likely consequence of being overly engaged, according to this distorted notion, with the material world. Okay, now Rav Kook then ends that passage we just read due to a lack of faith in the holiness of the land. Rav Kook ultimately brings us back to the sense of landedness as the expression of the collective Jewish body, and the lack of understanding that there is holiness in the land, which is another way of saying holiness in the body, right? The land is our collective body. Okay. I'd like to just pause here for a minute, and if anybody has a question or comment on anything we've said so far, this is a good time to take any comments or questions, just not too many, and then we'll go on.
I'm shaving my arms.
Oh, okay. Go for it. Anybody? Okay, let's go on. Now, Rav Kook continues. All of our teshuvah will succeed if, together with the splendor of its spirituality, there is as well a physical teshuvah. I'll explain this in a second. Now, teshuvah, I didn't translate on the text here. It literally means return. But it also is used in the sense of repentance, a return to our pristine original state of being godly, repentance in that sense, but it also is being used here as return, meaning return to the land, returning to the land of Israel, Zionism. So Rav Kook is saying that the return, repentance, and return in the sense of geographical return, return in the sense of national renaissance, will only succeed if there is a spiritual component to that, but more than that, that there is a physical return, a return to the body. We need to return to bodiliness, which fashions healthy blood, healthy flesh, solid, strong bodies, a fiery spirit shining forth upon strong muscles. That sounds like an ad for a fitness center. Healthy blood, healthy flesh, solid, strong bodies, a fiery spirit shining forth upon strong muscles. Wow. That in addition to spiritual renaissance, there happens to be this physical renaissance. And within the sanctified body will radiate the weakened soul evocative of bodily resurrection. That don't think that when we return to bodiness, we abandon the spirit. No, on the contrary, that to the extent that we have a body which has been reborn, that provides the casing, as it were, the environment for, in fact, a resurrection of a renewed spirit of the Jewish people. And he says this is evocative of the notion of resurrection. That resurrection means that, like in the vision of the dry bones of Ezekiel, that the bones are fashioned, they take on flesh and skin, etc., and then the spirit is instilled in that reinvigorated body. Okay. So Zionism, according to Rav Kook, is a return to the body, a return to our collective body, which will engender a return to bodiliness in terms of our own self-awareness and consciousness as Jews. And we're going to go on a little bit. The exercise done by the youth of Israel in the land of Israel in order to strengthen their bodies, to become strong sons for the nation, perfects the spiritual power of the supernal righteous who engage in the unification of the holy names. I'm sure that that sounded rather obscure. Let's explain it. Rav Kook is referring to the non-religious Zionist pioneers for whom physical fitness was a very strong value. And for those of you who have the source sheets, you'll see at the very end, I have a photograph from a mass calisthenics exercise from a neighborhood in Jerusalem where I used to work, in Beit HaKerem. And it shows these hundreds of Jewish pioneering youth, these secular youth, Zionist pioneers, who are all doing exercise together. Now, from the eyes of the ultra-Orthodox world, these are Sabbath desecrating, non-kosher eating, vilifiers of everything that is sacred to Judaism. These are Greeks, they're not Jews. These are worshipers of the body, a betrayal of our Jewish uniqueness, which is the spirit. And what does Rav Kook do? He praises them. He says that what they are doing is in fact perfecting the spiritual power of the righteous. Those who are involved in a life of piety, of learning Torah and praying, what they're doing will in fact be aided and perfected by other Jews who are engaged in bodiliness, that there's a complementary relationship between those Jews who somehow see their primary involvement in the nation as being involved in the physical, that creation of the body of the Jewish people will enhance the spirit, those Jews who are involved in a life of spirituality. The revelation of one light cannot exist without the other. There cannot not be such a thing as spirituality without physicality. Okay, now we're actually running out of time. So I'm going to skip a little bit. And we're going to go one step further in explaining just how controversial this teaching was. If you go to the next to the last paragraph of this particular section here, the last sentence in that next to last paragraph where it says both of them together focus on the body as well as the spirit. Both of them together perfect the network of holiness in its entirety. Through the accentuation of the character of the nation, through that brief passage upon which the entire body of the Torah depends, and all your ways know him. Now let's take a step back and I'm going to explain this. Rav Kook is quoting a passage in the Talmud. I want to show you that passage. Go to the next source. The Talmud says the following: Bar Kapara expounded, which is a brief scriptural passage upon which all the principles of the Torah depend. Answer, quotes a passage from the book of Proverbs, biblical book of Proverbs. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. So the Talmud there is saying, what is the central ethic? Is there a verse in the Hebrew Bible which represents the central ethic of Judaism? And the Talmud answers, yes, the verse says, in all thy ways acknowledge him. Meaning all thy ways, holistically, not just spirit, but physical as well. Not just the soul, but the body as well, on an individual level and on a collective level. We are incomplete without a body. We are incomplete unless we embrace worldliness, which is an expression of bodiliness. So Rav Kook is citing that passage in his essay. But he only paraphrases that passage from the Talmud to the point where the Talmud quotes the verse from Proverbs, in all thy ways acknowledge him. All thy ways, not just spiritual, but also physical. What's interesting, Rav Kook doesn't quote it, but every reader who is familiar with the Talmud, which would certainly be the ultra-Orthodox world, knows the next passage in the Talmud. The very next passage in the Talmud says, just look at that passage again, Bar Kapara expounded. Rava said, even for a matter of transgression. Know God even through transgression. I believe that Rav Kook had in mind, even though he didn't write it, the continuation of that passage in the Talmud. That knowing God means spiritual and physical and even transgression. Now, let me just show you why I'm pretty sure that Rav Kook had this in mind. Because now go up to the essay of Rav Kook, the last paragraph, where he says, and do not be astonished if there are deficiencies in the way of life of those involved in the fortification of the body and in all the terrestrial strengthening in Israel. In other words, Rav Kook is saying to his Orthodox readers, I've said very nice things about the Zionist pioneers who are involved in bodily things and in building the collective body of the Jewish people and their own personal bodies. And you might say, but how could you say such nice things about Jews who have abandoned traditional Jewish practice and belief? Rav Kook says, don't lose sleep over it. Don't be astonished if there are those deficiencies. So right after Rav Kook quoted that passage from the Talmud, which said you should know God in all your ways, and the Talmud said even in sin, in the very next paragraph, Rav Kook says the fact that they're sinners, in a technical sense, that shouldn't be astonishing to you. So that's why I'm very confident that Rav Kook had in mind that next sentence in the Talmud, which said that you could even know God through sin. That's also part of a holistic sense of being Jewish. Now, the question is, what does that mean to know God through sin? Before we answer that question, I want to just finish that last paragraph of Rav Kook's essay. Right? He says, don't be astonished if there are deficiencies in the way of life, right? That they sin. They don't keep kosher, they don't keep the Sabbath, etc. For even the manifestation of the Holy Spirit needs sifting from the admixture of impurity that is mixed within it. A hard sentence. It means the following. Ever since humanity partook of the tree of knowledge of good and evil are completely intertwined. There is no such thing in this planet as a pure good or a pure evil. Everything is complex. Everybody is a mixed bag. Have you noticed that? Everybody's just lived long enough to notice that we're all complex. We're all complex. Those Jews who are pious in a traditional sense, you don't think that there are impure aspects of the way they live? And those Jews who are not pious, you don't think that there's nobility and goodness in their lives? Everything is an admixture. Even the Holy Spirit is a mixture of this complex impurity and purity. And the historical process, Kabbalistically now, is the gradual separation to ultimately restore to a clarity of good and evil, which is the Garden of Eden before the sin. Now, that's a huge issue. We cannot get into that right now, but that's what he means there. And that historical process will eventually play itself out. I just read to the end of that paragraph. But it is continuously being purified, sanctified, and clarified. It redeems itself from exile till it becomes the path of the righteous. The brilliant light grows increasingly brighter until morn. That's this optimistic sense of Rav Kook's understanding of the historical process, which is this gradual sifting out of the positive and the negative, and ultimately the light shines in its brilliance of the dawn. Now I want to go back to what could it mean to serve God holistically in all your ways, even for a matter of transgression. That's what the Talmud says, and Rav Kook, I believe, is alluding to that because he's dealing with the transgressions of the Zionist pioneers. So Rashi, the most famous commentator in the Talmud, says, what does it mean transgression? You can serve God through transgression. And Rashi neutralizes that passage in the Talmud, which sounds very explosive, to serve God, acknowledge God even in transgression. What could that mean? And he cites a incident described in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, where Elijah, the prophet Elijah, builds an altar and he challenges the prophets of Baal to build their altar. And Elijah wants to prove that God is the only God. And the idolatrous gods being served by these other Jews, they're not authentic. He tells the prophets of Baal, go ahead and offer up an offering to your God, but without a match. You got to set on fire the offering, but call upon your gods to send out a fire to make the offering spontaneously combust. And they try that and nothing happens. And then Elijah, on his altar, he first soaks it with water, so it'd be more impressive. Hard to, if it's soaked with water, to make it combust. And a fire comes down from heaven and the whole altar combusts. Rashi points out, this is based upon a Talmudic analysis of that story, that was illegal what Elijah the prophet did, even though it was very impressive. And the Jews who witnessed that burst out saying, Hashem hu Elohim, the Lord is God. It was very impressive. And their being impressed lasted for about 5 minutes. But there is a prohibition building a sacrificial altar outside of Jerusalem. So how could Elijah have done that? It's a technical sin. He built a sacrificial altar outside of Jerusalem. It was in Haifa, Mount Carmel. And so Rashi says that's an example of serving God through sin. Sometimes in order to serve God, you have to do something a little bit illegal, but it was done consciously by Elijah for the sake of proving that God is the only God. So according to that explanation of the Talmud is not that radical. But I want to show you something. If you turn to at least the version that I printed up, it's the next to the last source. It turns out that almost every page in the Talmud has variant manuscripts. The edition that we have of the Talmud is based upon one specific manuscript of the Talmud. There are many manuscripts of the Talmud. I want to read to you a famous alternative manuscript of that same passage in the Talmud. Let's read it. This is the version that one of the great anthologies of Talmudic material of the stories in the Talmud contains. It's a book called Ein Yaakov. Rabbi Stewart will explain what Ein Yaakov is to you another time. Bar Kapara expounded, which is a brief scriptural passage upon which all the principles of the Torah depend. Quoting from Proverbs, so far it's exactly the same. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. Rava said, even for a matter of transgression. That's word for word the same. There's no variation there. But in that version of the Talmud, it goes on. Rav Papa, and this is missing in the edition that we use as the standard text of the Talmud. Rav Papa said, this is the meaning of the popular saying, a thief at the threshold calls out to the merciful one. What's an example of serving God in transgression? Not like Rashi said, Elijah the prophet building an altar outside of Jerusalem in order to prove that God is God. But what Rav Papa said explicitly, that what is an example of serving God in sin? By being a burglar who prays as he's burglaring. That's a far cry from Elijah the prophet building an altar to prove that God is God. That's a real sin. And it's a real sin done with the intention of sinning. And it's clear to me Rav Kook was thinking of this passage in the Talmud, according to this version of the Talmud, that even sin can be spiritually meaningful. Even sin in a very complex way. These Zionist youths who are paying such attention to bodiliness and are in an incredibly self-sacrificing way, dedicating themselves to the physical renaissance of the Jewish people, at the same time that they don't keep kosher, don't keep the Sabbath, and do sinful things according to traditional Jewish observance. Even that sin, in a complex way, is part of this process that, in God's sense of humor, is going to lead to the renaissance of the Jewish people. The Jewish people's return, holistically, spiritual renaissance within a revived and reborn body. Now, I'm going to end just in the next couple minutes by showing you something fascinating. Theodor Herzl, the visionary of political Zionism, had an associate named Max Nordau, who is less famous than Theodor Herzl. But he was also a journalist. He was also a physician by day. He was a doctor by training, but he was mostly involved as a journalist and a writer, and a Zionist theoretician. Listen to this quote from Max Nordau, 1903. This is part of a speech he gave at the Zionist convention. We must think of creating once again a Jewry of muscles. A Jewry of muscles. In the narrow Jewish street, our poor limbs soon forgot their gay movements. In the dimness of sunless houses, our eyes began to blink shyly, the ghetto. The fear of constant persecution turned our powerful voices into frightened whispers, which rose in a crescendo only when our martyrs on the stakes cried out their dying prayers in the face of the executioners. But now, all coercion has become a memory of the past. And at last we are allowed space enough for our bodies to live again. Let us take up our oldest traditions, the biblical image of the Jew who's a warrior as well as a scholar. Let us once more become deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men. 1903, Max Nordau. And Max Nordau was the very opposite of a traditional Jew. Max Nordau had already as a teenager abandoned any semblance of traditional Jewish life and thought. And at a certain point in his life, he actually felt that assimilating into Christianity would be the best way to secure the well-being of the Jewish people. And then he became, when he saw that that wasn't working so well, thought that Zionism was the answer. Do you see how Rav Kook, in his Kabbalistic way, is echoing the precise sentiment of Max Nordau? Can you imagine if you're coming from a traditionalist perspective and you hear Rav Kook talking, Rav Kook who's wearing a shtreimel, this Hasidic furry hat, and with long payas and the long black garb, and who is spending his time in study and in prayer, and also very active as a rabbinic leader. But the words coming out of his pen sound a lot like Max Nordau. But coming from this unique Jewish perspective, spiritual perspective, where the ideas of Max Nordau, I'm not saying he borrowed from Max Nordau, that's not my point. These are parallel movements towards the same conclusion of a call for the renaissance of the Jewish people, the return to bodliness. But can you imagine that in the eyes of the ultra-Orthodox world, they listen to Rav Kook, they hear the voice of Max Nordau. Who are you? This great rabbi who's a complete master of traditional learning and so pious, but you scratch the surface deep down. This Rav Kook sounds like Max Nordau. Wow. So I hope you can see from our discussion this evening several things. One of them is the unique, fresh perspective of Rav Kook, the way he was able to relate to the Zionist movement in such a unique and fresh way, to translate it in spiritual terms according to the way he understood historical forces operating at this time of Renaissance. I hope you'll also understand why he was so suspect in the eyes of the traditionalists. Now, I personally am a big fan of Rav Kook. But I think it's important to be able to appreciate that when Rav Kook was condemned and vilified and defamed, I'm not justifying any of those things, but I want you to appreciate that it was based upon not a misunderstanding, but precisely an understanding of just how radical and fresh Rav Kook's thinking was. And on a final note, Rav Kook died in 1935. It's now 2020, is that correct? Something like that. I would like to think, and I'm very confident, Rav Kook's vision is being fulfilled as we speak. The Jewish people, in terms of relate to bodliness, has been transformed. I want to end with just a little quick anecdote. It's personal. It's not very salacious. You can calm down. I grew up in Sacramento, the holy city of Sacramento. And my parents came from, my mother was born in the Ukraine, came to the United States as a child. My father was actually from Lithuanian Jewish descent, a Litvak, from an Orthodox family. And he was a physician, my father. They were not traditionally observant. my parents. But it's interesting that they had imbibed the sensibility which Rav Kook condemns, even though they were no longer religious in a traditional sense. Anything that had to be done in our house that had anything to do with hands, you call Joe Tognoli, who was this Italian guy who could fix things. I was always amazed. On Sunday mornings, there were very few Jews in Sacramento. I lived in a suburb of Sacramento, Carmichael. My non-Jewish neighbors, the adults, would be out there washing their boats, mowing their lawns on Sunday. I had no idea. Why would anybody they could afford to hire a gardener. They could afford to have somebody wash their boat or their car. They did it because they enjoyed it. They worked in their gardens because it spoke to something deep within human nature. In my house, anything that had to be done physically, you hired a non-Jew to do it. Jews don't have hands, right? Only souls, or only brains, in the case of my father. This is not a criticism of my father. I love my father very much. It's to show you how deeply ingrained this sensibility was, that how it remained even in, I was born in 1956, even in the 50s and 60s. But you know what? I'll bet a lot of times in LA, if you want to have something done, you call an Israeli. It's really interesting. The Israelis in LA have very much, plumbers, electricians, the moving business, contractors. The state of Israel has engendered a collective return to bodiness in a very profound way. We're not done yet. And we also have to see to the spiritual ongoing renaissance of the Jewish people as well. But I believe that Rav Kook, in his radical and fresh thinking, has given us a roadmap to navigate the historical process as it unfolds in front of us. Thank you so much for joining me this evening for a rather long discussion. I apologize for going beyond, but if anybody would like to be in touch with me, everybody has my email address. If you don't have it, ask anybody and they'll give it to you. I'm glad to take questions offline, and we can take maybe just a couple of questions or comments online right now. So you have to unmute yourself if you want. Did anybody want to make a question or a comment?
Yes,
David.
It puzzles me because the tefillah is so full of allusions to the predominance of the body, like when it says, Elohim nishama shenatata b'tahurahi atavarata. You return the soul to me. In other words, me is not my soul. Me is my body. And the tefillah is filled with analogies of God to the body, not to some ephemeral spiritual kind of reality. And it's even in the Shemona Esrei, where it talks about Mechayim 18. What is that? I mean, why go through? Why did the rabbis adapt this interest in the revivification of the dead? I mean, if the body is really superfluous, why don't we just exist in the afterlife as spiritual beings? Why bring along this body stuff?
Yeah.
And in fact, it's not the conclusion of the process. It's when we come back to our bodies, it's the conclusion of the process. Like the afterlife is not the end. It's one of the way stations, it seems like.
Yeah. Okay. So you should probably mute yourself now, David, and then it's so convenient. I can say anything I want to, but he can't talk. So two responses. One is, you're right. The fact, and that's what Rav Kook, in a certain sense, that Max Nordau was saying, right? That when Max Nordau talked about returning to, let us take up our oldest traditions. I mean, Max Nordau had sort of this biblical vision of, the Jews, very worldly. The fact that when you look at traditional Jewish sources, it's not that we're oblivious to the notion of bodiliness. And all your examples were wonderful examples, and everything's, you're right. But we have this amazing ability to somehow either not give sufficient attention to those passages or to interpret them in a slightly different way. So for instance, one could possibly have an idea that what's the purpose of resurrection of the dead? It's so that we can return once again to a life of traditional piety, which involves Jewish vote, and sanctity being the entire texture of our existence. But it's limited to these points of specific defined sacred acts called mitzvot. And that after we're resurrected and the world is a perfect place again, we have a body, we'll use that body to be able to do these isolated islands of sacred acts, right? Rather than this notion of seeing, of this holistic sense of being whole again, right? Soul in a body, and all of life being fertile ground for sanctification. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Mrs. Smith. You have to unmute yourself.
Andy,
are you about to say something?
Yourself.
Question. Yeah. Did Rav Kook identify, besides Agudat Yisrael, did he identify with any stream of Judaism other than generally Orthodox? Was he raised in a particular way of relating to Judaism, like Ger?
Yeah. No, so he's basically a Litvak, right? His father, that's what I was saying in the beginning. His father was a Litvak coming from the Vilna Gaon, that whole tradition. His mother was a Chabad, a Hasidic Jew. That was her ancestry. But, and Rav Kook was influenced by that. But in terms of sort of like some active identification, Rav Kook didn't consider himself like a member of any particular party, or sect or anything like that. But I would just say on an institutional level, Rav Kook never joined any other movement other than Agudat Yisrael. He never became a member of Mizrahi, the religious Zionist movement, interestingly enough, ever. And Rav Kook was actually very critical of religious Zionism as expressed by Mizrahi. He felt that they didn't understand. It was sort of like putting a yarmulke on the head of secular Zionism. That's how he understood religious Zionism of his time. That it's basically Zionism with a kippah, right? Zionism with kosher food. Because Rav Kook felt that one has to completely rethink in a most fundamental way one's whole sense of what it means to be a Jew, of what historical process is playing itself out right now. He felt that religious Zionism was superficial. It didn't sufficiently understand in religious, spiritual, Kabbalistic terms, the depths of what was happening around us at that time. Any other questions or comments before we call it a night or a day, like for me? Yes.
So to follow up then, who would he most identify with now, do you think?
Oh boy, that's an impossible, this is like, the great Maimonides Rambam. Everybody wants the Rambam on their side. It's good he died 800 years ago, so it's safe, right? The Lubavitchers say that he was actually a Lubavitcher. At the end of his life, he gave up his rational Aristotelian influence, and they even have a letter to prove it. Believe it or not, every historian says it's fake, in which he says, his guide for the perplexed was he regrets writing it, and now he's a Lubavitcher. I mean, it doesn't literally say that, but that's the idea. That's the way it is with great personalities, that everybody wants to own them. So it's an impossible question to answer. Though I think he would actually be exactly like me. That's a joke. I would like to be like him, but yeah, that's impossible. Any other comments or questions? Okay, we'll stop here. It was truly a delight, and
Thank you, Rabbi Zeff. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
I want to
Thank you. It was wonderful. Yeah.
I want to wish everybody also a wonderful and successful fundraiser coming up.
Amen.
And I'll also tell you that I love your rabbi.
We do too.
He is and among all his other many qualities, he is. You probably know he's the voice of an angel.
Thank you, Rabbi Zeff.
And that's
Thank
just
you.
icing on the cake. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Laila Tov.